The radio murmured in the background, a voice too familiar, too tired, reciting headlines from cities miles away. Protests. Statues toppled. Words like equality and justice buzzed through static. Josh Harlan turned the knob, cutting off the voice mid-sentence. Silence. Just the creak of his work boots on old floorboards and the bitter scent of paint thinner in the air. He was in the middle of repainting an abandoned liquor store. The owner wanted it ready for lease, probably to some guy with enough cash to turn it into a vape shop. Josh didn't care. Walls were walls, and white paint covered everything the same. Out front, the town of Hadley stretched in tired lines of cracked concrete and sagging porches. Once a thriving manufacturing hub, now a limping reminder of promises unkept. It was white, not just the buildings, the people, not by law, but by habit. Josh was 27, lean and always half scowling. His hands were stained with old paint, and his eyes rarely lifted past the next surface he had to cover. He lived 2 blocks from the shop in a house he inherited from his father, who died coughing out his last breath between Fox News and a bottle of whiskey. That evening, Josh stood outside, wiping sweat from his brow, when an old neighbor called across the street. "Hey, Harlan, you see what they're doing in Chicago? Burning their own neighborhoods down." Josh nodded vaguely. "Idiots," he muttered, unsure if he believed it. It was just easier to agree. The man chuckled, disappeared into his truck. Josh lit a cigarette and stared at the sun setting behind telephone wires. That night, he got a call. A new program, city-funded. Business owners could get a worker at half wage, part of an initiative to reduce recidivism. "You don't even have to pay the whole check," the woman on the phone said cheerfully. "Just sign here." He did. Malik Jefferson was early. Josh wasn't. He showed up 5 minutes late, chewing on a gas station breakfast sandwich and holding 2 coffees, one for himself. He stopped short when he saw Malik standing by the truck, wearing a gray hoodie, hands in his pockets. "You the new guy?" Josh asked. Malik nodded. "Malik." Josh didn't offer his name, just handed him a paintbrush. "We're doing primer today. Don't drip." Malik said nothing. They worked side by side in silence for hours, the only sound the hiss of rollers and the soft splash of paint. Josh watched him from the corner of his eye. Tall, wiry, barely older than a kid, but with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't ask what Malik had done. The program said nonviolent, and that was enough. By lunchtime, Josh started testing the waters. "So, you from around here?" "South Side," Malik said. "Moved when I was a kid." Josh nodded. "Not many brothers in this neighborhood." Malik's hand didn't stop moving. "Not many jobs, either." Josh smirked. "Well, lucky you. You got one now." Malik glanced at him, expression unreadable. That night, Josh sat in his truck, watching people pass. An older woman pulled her child closer when Malik walked by her on the sidewalk. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Josh looked down at his hands. Still smelled like paint. Always did. By the second week, the joke started. Josh didn't think they were offensive. Just old habits. The kind of things his dad used to say. He tossed them out casually, like dropping peanut shells. "You paint as slow as you run from the cops," he said one morning. Malik didn't laugh. Just looked at him, then went back to rolling the wall. Josh shrugged. "Jesus, calm down. It's a joke." Later, they worked in a retired school building turned community center. The place smelled like old pencil shavings and ghosted laughter. Malik was sent to the top floor to scrape old lead paint. Josh stayed below. After hours of silence, Malik came down soaked in sweat, shirt clinging to his ribs. Josh tossed him a bottle of water. "Bet prison wasn't as hot, huh?" Malik drank without answering. He didn't meet Josh's eyes. The next day, a man from the neighborhood walked by while they were repainting a fence. He stopped and stared at Malik. Didn't know Josh started running a zoo. Josh laughed too quickly. "He works harder than half my old crew." Malik dropped his brush and walked inside. Josh didn't follow. He told himself Malik needed thicker skin, that it was just the way people were here. He told himself a lot of things that night. None of them felt true. The morning air in Hadley was heavier than usual, like it soaked up every curse, every whisper, every stomped-down cry that the town buried under its sidewalks. And when Josh pulled up his truck with half a cup of cold coffee and a hangover stitched into the corners of his mind, he found Malik already waiting on the curb with a quiet look that didn't ask questions and didn't give answers, just nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. Without a word, the silence between them like the kind that thickens over time. Not uncomfortable, just charged. And they drove across town to an old 2-story house that had once been a law office but now sat hollow, owned by a man who didn't care who painted it as long as it looked white again. And Malik didn't flinch when Josh handed him a scraper and pointed the peeling ceiling upstairs. Just climbed the ladder with the kind of steadiness born in people who've had no choice but to balance in worse places. An hour in the ceiling. Groaned like an old throat clearing a secret, and then a slab of it cracked and came down fast and hard, catching Malik right across the scalp with a sickening crunch, and Josh heard it before he saw it. Heard that dull meat sound of skin splitting, and when he ran up, Malik was on the floor, blood already crawling down his temple, his face calm in a way that made Josh's stomach twist. Like this wasn't the worst thing that happened to him this week, and Josh grabbed a towel, muttering something like, "You good, just a scratch." But Malik didn't say anything, just pressed the cloth and stared at the wall like he could see something Josh couldn't, and maybe he could, because when he stood up he didn't wobble or curse. He just went back to work, and that night when Josh dropped him off, he asked, almost out of habit, "You ever think about quitting?" And Malik said, "Every day," before closing the door without looking back. And the next week they were sent to paint a community center on the edge of Hadley, where the walls had been tagged with words that drip like wounds. "You don't belong," "Keep Hadley clean," and worse things spelled in symbols and crude slurs, and Josh muttered something like "animals," and Malik paused, his roller still mid-stroke, and asked, "Who you talking about?" And Josh didn't answer, just went back to painting, faster this time, as if speed could erase what had already been written, and later, while taking a break on the back steps, Malik lit a cigarette and said, "You think if I wore a suit and smiled more, they'd let me walk through a grocery store without thinking I'm stealing." And Josh tried to laugh, but it died in his throat because he remembered his uncle muttering something about those people whenever the news showed anything louder than silence. And the truth was Josh had never had to think about it. Not really. Not until Malik said it with that flat calm, like he wasn't looking for sympathy, just naming the sky for what it was. And then came the house on Brentwood, a red brick thing with a big flag in a window and a lawn trimmed down to military discipline. And the man who hired them stood with arms folded and eyes like winter. And when Malik reached out to shake his hand, the man didn't move, just looked at Josh and said, "Didn't know this was a package deal." And Josh laughed like it was a joke. But it wasn't, and the man let them in, but watched every move Malik made like he was inventory. And by the end of the day, Malik's knuckles were raw from sanding, and Josh's mouth tasted like shame. And that night, someone threw a rock through Josh's truck window with a note that read, "Wrong side, traitor." And Josh stared at it for a long time, tried to decide if it was meant for him, or Malik, or both. And the next morning, Malik didn't show up, and Josh went by his apartment, knocked until the door opened a crack, and Malik's eye, swollen and bloodshot, peered out, and Josh saw the bruises blooming on his face like dark flowers. And Malik just said, "Don't worry about it," and shut the door. And Josh stood there a long time, fists in his pockets, stomach full of coals, before walking back to the truck like he wasn't burning inside. And the jobs didn't stop, and neither did the looks, the whispers, the sudden quiet when Malik walked into a gas station or crossed the street. And it all came to a head one Monday morning when they were painting a garage near the edge of town, and a cop car pulled up, slow, blue lights off, just sitting there watching, engine humming like a predator waiting for movement. And Josh waved casual, but Malik kept working, eyes down, shoulders tight. And then the door opened and the cop stepped out and said, "Got ID, son?" And Malik didn't flinch, just wiped his hands and pulled out his wallet, handed it over without a word. And the cop stared at it like it was a confession, and Josh stepped in, saying, "He's working for me." And the cop looked him over, said, "You vouching for him?" And Josh said yes, and the cop gave the ID back and said, "Watch your tools," before getting in and driving off. And the silence after was sharp, and Josh said, "He didn't mean anything." And Malik just laughed, low and joyless, and said, "They never do." And that night, Josh found himself looking at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering when exactly he'd stopped noticing the lines being drawn and started stepping over them. And the next day they were back, at it again, painting another house, another wall, another layer of silence over the ugliness underneath. And Josh asked, "Why keep doing it?" And Malik said, "Because I'm still here." And that was enough, at least for that day. But what neither of them knew was that something was building behind all of it, something that didn't care about pain or progress or quiet agreements, something waiting to break. It started with a knock at the door, so quiet it almost didn't happen, but Josh heard it anyway, because he hadn't really been asleep, just laying there on the couch with the TV flickering static over a half-empty bottle and a half-eaten sandwich that had gone warm with time. And when he opened the door, Malik was there, soaked in rain, shirt clinging to his back, his face cut across the cheekbone and his knuckles raw like he'd punched concrete. And he didn't say anything for a long time, just stood there with that same look from months ago, the one that said this is happening whether you like it or not. And Josh stepped aside and let him in. No questions, no words, just silence and the smell of wet asphalt and blood. And Malik sat on the edge of the couch like it belonged to someone else and whispered, "They beat him in front of his kid." And Josh didn't ask who. Didn't have to, because it was always the same story, different names, different blocks, same uniforms. And Malik said, 10 years old, Josh. 10. And Josh sat down across from him and listened as Malik told the story like pulling teeth from his own mouth. How his cousin Darnell had been stopped for running a stop sign that wasn't even there. How they had pulled him from the car in front of his son. How 3 officers had taken turns stomping him because he moved fast enough. How the kid screamed until his throat gave out and then just sat there shaking. And how nobody did a thing except hold up their phones and record it like a horror show you could scroll past. And Josh felt something twist inside him, something hot and wrong, because all this time he thought he understood, but he didn't. Not really, not until Malik said, "They won't charge him. They got body cams, and they still won't do it." And Josh asked, "What are you going to do?" And Malik said, "I'm not asking for help. I'm asking if you'll drive." And Josh nodded without thinking, without knowing. And that night, they drove out past the city limits, Malik with a backpack full of something heavy on his lap, eyes forward like he was staring down the whole country. And Josh didn't ask where, just followed the road until they reached a house with lights still on at midnight, the house of one of the cops involved. And Malik got out slow, walked up the porch, rang the bell, and when the door opened there was a flash of movement, a sound like thunder, and then silence. And when he came back to the truck, his hands were empty, his face unreadable, and he said, he looked me in the eyes and laughed. And Josh started the truck and drove, heart slamming against his ribs, the road behind him stretching like a fuse already lit. And in the days that followed, Hadley changed, not loudly but in small ways, like a dog smelling smoke before the fire. Whispers grew louder, eyes lingered longer, and then the story broke. Not the truth, but the version wrapped in a flag. On the news, they called it an attempted home invasion by an unknown suspect. And they showed footage of the cop's house with cracked window and blood on the porch, and Josh watched from his living room while Malik stood in the doorway, hands shaking, saying, "They erased it before he even died." And Josh knew it was coming. They both did. The pressure building, the faces turning, and then came the protest. Not one of those. Peaceful ones with signs and songs, but the kind born from too many broken bones and unanswered prayers. Malik stood on the courthouse steps with a megaphone, voice sharp as broken glass. And he called it what it was, murder, power, rot. And the crowd lit up like oil, fists in the air, voices raw. And when the cops came, they came like a storm, batons out, faces blank behind plastic shields. And the first crack of tear gas hit the crowd like a bomb. People scattered, but Malik stood firm, yelling, through the burn, through the chaos. And Josh was there too, caught in the wave, trying to find him through smoke and screams. And then someone grabbed Malik from behind, threw him to ground, 3 knees on his back, handcuffs biting into skin, and Josh lunged forward but caught a bat into the ribs that dropped him hard. And from the ground he watched as they dragged Malik away, blood trailing on the pavement, the sound of sirens and helicopters overhead screaming louder than the people. And when the sun rose over Hadley the next morning, it rose on a city broken open, glass in the streets, fires and trash cans, posters of Malik's face already on every pole. Wanted, dangerous, agitator, and the news said he was being held without bail, for public safety. And Josh tried to visit him, but they wouldn't let him in, said he wasn't on the list, said he wasn't family, and he said, I am... And they laughed in his face. And when he got home, there was a letter on his door with no return. Address, just a single sentence in shaky handwriting. You picked the wrong side. And from that day forward, things weren't the same. The jobs dried up. The friends stopped calling. And Eva's mother asked him if he was still hanging around with that troublemaker. And Josh didn't answer. Just hung up the phone and stared out the window, because something in him had snapped, not in a loud, dramatic way, but like a rope worn thin over time, and now it was gone, and all he could think about was Malik sitting in that cell, alone, bruised, hated, and how all of this wasn't just about one night or one town. It was everything, everywhere, always. And he knew then that silence was no longer an option, that neutrality was a ghost story white folks told themselves to sleep at night. And he started writing, started speaking, started showing up, even when it cost him, especially when it did. And one night, weeks later, when he stood at a podium in front of 100 people and told them what happened, what really happened, he ended with this. He didn't just bleed for himself. He bled for all of us. And I'll never shut up again. And the room went quiet, not because they agreed, but because they finally heard it, and outside the wind howled like something had finally cracked open, like the country itself was listening, even if only for a second. And from a window in a prison cell, Malik stared at the same sky and smiled for the first time in months, because even behind bars, the fire had spread. The night after the courthouse steps emptied and the last of the tear gas smoke mingled with streetlights, Josh found himself on the rooftop of his mother's house. The same place he'd watched sunsets with his father before the whiskey stole him and the factory closed down. And now the sky was a bruised purple and the air buzzed with distant sirens and the hum of conversations that stopped when they saw his face, and he held a folded flyer in his hand. Malik's face, free Jefferson, and the edges curled from rain. But he didn't care about the paper. He cared about the silence that wrapped around him tighter than any cell could, the kind of silence that only trauma knows. And he remembered how it felt when Malik first climbed into his truck months ago and didn't speak. And he'd been glad for quiet then, but now it felt like a coffin lid sliding shut, and Josh closed his eyes and took a breath that rattled his chest, felt the rough concrete under his palms, and thought about all. The words he'd spoken the weeks since that first protest, how they'd spilled in his mouth like blood, bright and warm, and then dried to cracks. And he realized that words were nothing without echoes, without people to hear them and pass them on. And in Hadley, the echoes were dying. So he climbed down the ladder, barefoot on splintered wood, and went inside to find his mother asleep in a chair, TV flickering a comfort show laugh track at 2 a.m. And he stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time, thinking about how she never asked questions, just cried when she heard about Malik's beating or the gas or the jail, but never thought to call the mayor or write to paper or stand outside the station. She stayed safe inside, and he got angry, but then he understood. She was like everyone else, stuck between fear and habit, and the way trouble always seemed to belong to someone else. He slipped into his room, found his old notebook, lined pages full of half-finished poems and angry scribbles, and he wrote Malik's name at the top in big letters, underlined it, and then he wrote until the ink ran dry, filling page after page with every memory of Malik's calm stare, every time his hand shook when someone spat on him, every time Josh laughed it off and then felt his belly twist with shame. And he wrote about the night in the rain when Malik walked in bleeding and didn't look for sympathy, just survival. And Josh wrote until his hand cramped, until he fell asleep at the desk with the lamp burning, the pages curling around him like a nest of questions. The next morning, he went to Malik's cell block, passing rows of bars, guards who didn't look twice, the scent of bleach and fear. And when he reached the door, he hesitated. He'd planned a speech, rehearsed words about justice and brotherhood, but those words felt empty again, like shells. Instead, he knelt on one knee, looked through the bars at Malik sitting on his bunk, staring at the same cracked ceiling that Malik had blamed for his ceiling fall, and Josh said, "I don't know what to say," and Malik blinked, then sighed, and the tension between them cracked just enough for something human to slip through. "Then don't," Malik whispered, and Josh uncuffed the flyer from his belt and slid it through the bars. Malik studied it, eyes red, and then he nodded once, quick like a blade, and pressed his fist to the paper, leaving a smudge of blood on the photo, and Josh felt that smudge in his gut, a promise or a challenge. He didn't know which. He stood and left, And in the hall, he found the chaplain, a pale man with tired eyes, who asked, "You got a plan?" And Josh said, "I'm going to write letters." And the chaplain nodded, as though that could change anything. Outside, a pigeon cooed and took off, and Josh thought of Malik in a cell in the country outside that cell, somewhere between broken and burning. And he knew that letters were tiny arrows shot into darkness, that maybe they'd hit something, maybe not. But if you didn't fire, you'd never know. That afternoon, he rented a typewriter, tapped keys like a drumbeat, to the people who believe silence is safety. And he didn't stop until his fingers ached, and he printed stacks of 100 flyers and distributed them downtown, past closed shops and empty porches, past faces that stared or looked away or laughed, and each flyer was a question. What will you do? And he pressed them into strangers' hands, shoved them under windshield wipers, slipped them into mailboxes, and at every step he felt Malik's eyes on his back, silent and steady. The city reacted in waves. Some laughed and crumpled the papers. Others stared at them like a puzzle piece they didn't want to fit, and a few showed up at his mother's door, asking for more, saying they wanted to help, and Josh felt that spark, that echo of Malik's fire, and he realized justice wasn't a place you reached. It was a noise you kept making until it drowned out the lies. As dusk fell, he returned to the rooftop, watched headlights snake through rain-slick streets, and he took a breath and yelled, once, loud enough to crack windows, "We will not be silent." And the echo didn't come back at first, but behind him, a rooftop across the street, he saw a light flick on, saw a figure lift a flyer to the sky, and he smiled, because that was the echo he needed, a single answer in darkness, and he knew then that silence was dead, buried under words and blood, and the courage to speak them. And below, somewhere in the jail, Malik smiled too, because even behind bars, the fire had become a roar, and it would never die. The end. What did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us if you have ever experienced racism in your life. You are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Please subscribe and hit the like button to stay updated. Have a great day. Right, I will not stay silent. In the comments, so we know you listen to the end.